Galakross is the first boss in the second part of the Siege of Orgrimmar Raid Finder, the Gates of Retribution, and it requires a bit of preparation before the pull. To the left and right of the main area where most of the fighting will be taking place, you'll notice two towers on the two hills. A group of players consisting of one tank, one healer, and 2 to 3 DPS needs to be chosen to handle these towers before the pull in order to make the fight run smoothly, as well as 2 of those DPS will need to be chosen to man the 2 cannons that are on the top of the 2 towers. The majority of this fight is killing groups of adds that run in from farther down the path, and these adds should be pulled backwards until they are standing in the Flame Strike that Aethys Sunreaver will spawn, or the Blizzard that Jaina Proudmoore will spawn depending on whether you're playing Horde or Alliance. 2 adds are notable here. The Dragonmaw Shaman will drop healing totems that must be killed quickly, and the Bone Crushers will occasionally charge the notable NPCs and begin casting an incredibly damaging move on him. In order to free the NPC, the add must be stunned or CC'd. Flag Bearers will occasionally drop banners that must be killed quickly to remove the damage increase that they cause. As indicated by a counter on the top of your screen, eventually one of the towers will be breached and the tower team will need to begin moving toward the tower. Now, just before each tower is breached, a special mini-boss will spawn that the ground team needs to handle. These mini-bosses are not incredibly problematic and should simply be focused down. Korgar the Snake, who comes out before the first tower is breached, will spawn clouds of poison that shouldn't be stood in, and Enforcer Thranok, who spawns when the second tower is about to be breached, will hook players to him and cause a 360-degree AoE that players should simply again move out of. When the tower is actually breached, a Demolisher on the ground will also spawn that should be a top priority to kill, as it AoEs the tower, dealing decent damage to everyone in it and stunning on each impact. Once the Demolisher is down, the tower team should immediately run into the tower and the tank gather up all the adds and run to the top and engage the mini-boss up there. The mini-boss should be the top priority, as he does a decent damaging frontal cone attack that needs to be avoided. While this attack will not knock you off the tower like it would in Flex or Normal, it should still be avoided. Once all the adds in the tower are dead, the cannon on the top will become usable, and that should be used to shoot down nearby Proto-Drakes. Once shot down, the ground tank needs to pick them up, as they do a frontal cone fire attack that should be moved out of, even by the tank. After the tower has been cleared, the tower group returns to the ground and assists until the second tower is breached, upon which they handle it exactly the same as the first tower. The second tower boss hits slightly harder than the first, and again has a frontal cone attack that should be avoided. Just before all the adds in the second tower go down, one of the DPS in the tower group needs to return to the first tower and jump back in the first cannon and target the boss, as once the second cannon becomes usable, it takes shots from both cannons to knock the boss to the ground. Once the boss is down, he should be immediately picked up by the ground tank, and the raid should stack behind him, and the tower group should of course return to the ground and rejoin the rest of the raid. The boss applies a stacking debuff as a cone in front of him, so the tanks should not stand together, and should switch at 3 to 4 stacks of the debuff. There is intense raid damage going on, and this is a burn phase where Bloodlust and all DPS cooldowns need to be blown, and healing cooldowns should also be saved, or healers should at least make sure they are up for this phase as well. Throughout the fight, there will be things that should not be stood in. Fire patches caused by fire arrows, poison, and AoE damage. Players should know what they're doing for the towers, and who is doing what, and healers should also pay attention to the NPC's health, as their deaths will also cause a wipe. Handle the towers correctly, kill the Shaman's totems, and burn the boss before he burns your group, and Galakross should go down. The second boss in the Siege of Orgrimmar, Gates of Retribution, is the Iron Juggernaut, a large siege mech with 2 phases that, while it does not have a large number of mechanics, can be extremely healing intensive if the mechanics aren't handled properly. There are multiple locations that different groups have decided to tank this boss in, and regardless of where the boss is chosen to be tanked, it is important that players can have their backs toward a fence or a terrain impediment that stops them from getting knocked back far away from the boss. I will talk more about this mechanic later on in the video. While tanking this boss, it is important that the boss is faced away from the group, as he does a damaging frontal cone attack called Flame Vents that causes a stacking debuff on the tank. As all frontal cone attacks, the off-tank must make sure to not be standing in front of the boss as well. Simply taunt off at 3 stacks or whenever your debuff falls off in order to handle this mechanic. The boss will also use an ability called Borer Drill, which drills into the ground in front of him and causes lines of spiking earth to shoot out from the impact point, and create ground effects that should not be stood in. You should not need to move the boss when avoiding these. Simply position your character carefully to avoid standing in them. The boss will also periodically launch out 3 mines that will embed themselves in the ground and begin a countdown sequence that can be seen in gradually filling circles above them. If they explode, they will deal a large amount of damage to the entire raid. To avoid this, the off-tank needs to right-click on top of these mines in order to jump on top of them and explode them early. This will deal a large amount of damage to the tank. Using mitigation of some kind is advised. Though tank should be the primary role handling this, DPS can also help jump on these mines, though in order to survive, or at least not overly panic your healers, defensive cooldown should be used. The boss will also be shooting demolisher cannons at random locations indicated by a red circle on the ground. Simply don't stand in it. During this phase, the boss will also periodically put a debuff called Laser Burn on random players, which is a very painful dot effect that simply needs to be healed through. Be careful, as this ability can also target the current main tank, and a combination of the boss's stacking dot effect, laser burn, and the boss auto attacks can cause large spikes in damage to the tank. Simply be prepared for this. After a set amount of time, the boss will enter Phase 2, and no longer need to be tanked, and he cannot be moved. He will still launch out mines and use his cannons, but instead of applying a debuff to random players, his laser burn will now be a beam that will lock on and follow random players. He will also spew out oil patches on the ground that should not be stood in. Avoid dragging the laser through the oil patches as they will explode and deal large amount of raid damage. The most important mechanic in this phase is the boss's periodic Shock Pulse ability. This ability does a small amount of damage but also launches players a huge distance away from the boss. If players are not positioned properly, they can be launched way out of healing and DPS range, which results in less DPS on the boss and can often result in death, due to the large amount of AoE damage occurring in this phase. To avoid this, players need to be sure to have their backs to a fence, wall, or terrain impediment in order to catch them as they are launched back. After a set amount of time, the boss will change back to Phase 1 mechanics, and the fight continues just the same as before. Make sure to properly position yourselves during Phase 2 to handle the shock pulses, avoid harmful ground effects, and handle the mines properly, and the boss goes down without too much trouble. The third boss in the Gates of Retribution, Siege of Orgrimmar Raid Finder, are the 2 Dark Shamans, Earthbreaker Haram and Wavebinder Cardris. These 2 bosses make for a rather chaotic fight with a lot of emphasis on simply reacting to the mechanics as they occur. At the start of the fight, the Shaman will be riding their wolves and will dismount to engage the raid. The raid should burn the wolves down as fast as possible, with the tanks making sure to face the wolves away from the raid group. The Shamans share health, so cleaving and multi-dotting is recommended to increase DPS. Wavebinder Cardris will cast Froststorm Bolt, while Earthbreaker Haram will use Froststorm Strike, which necessitates a tank swap at roughly 5 stacks or whenever the other tank stacks fall off. As the fight progresses, the Shamans will gain more abilities. When the Shamans reach 85% health, they will gain 2 abilities. Haram gains Toxic Mist, which is simply a dot on random players that needs to be healed through, and increases the nature damage those players take, which means those players need to be more careful about handling Cardris' new ability, Toxic Storm, which causes a large swirling storm to appear and move about the area, spawning purple tornadoes that need to be avoided. At 65% health, Haram gains Foul Stream ability, which targets a random player and after a few seconds blasts a stream of poisonous water at them, damaging them and anyone else in a line from Haram to that player. The player targeted needs to move and make sure that no one else will be caught by the line by moving to an open area with no one in between them and the boss. Cardris gains Foul Geyser, which will target her current tank with a pulsing dot that also spawns slimes every half second. These slimes do tremendous AoE damage, and should be kited and killed by ranged DPS. Melee and tanks should avoid these slimes. At 50% health, Haram gains the ability Ashen Wall, which will spawn a line of stationary elementals that spread out from his current tank's position, parallel to the way he is facing. Tanks need to be careful when tanking him and try to make sure that he is facing straight at the edges of the area, so that the line of elementals is spread along the outer edge of the boss's area. Otherwise, you'll wind up with a line of elementals going directly across the battle area, often blocking where the raid needs to move. Cardress gains the ability Falling Ash, which is a large damaging effect that is indicated by a large red circle on the ground. Simply move out of it to avoid it. The bosses will Bloodlust at 25% health, increasing their damage by a decent amount. Bloodlust should be blown at this point to help finish them off quickly. This fight can become rather chaotic as it requires a large amount of movement, kiting the slimes, moving away from tornadoes, ashen wall, and falling ash. Tanks should attempt to keep the bosses stationary as much as they possibly can, and avoid extraneous movement, though this sometimes can be impossible due to bad timing with many of their mechanics. There is an alternate strategy that drastically simplifies the fight, though it requires 3 tanks, and unfortunately I do not have footage of this strategy. However, it is a rather simple to execute. The fight begins the same way as always. However, once the wolves are dead, 2 tanks, and 2 to 3 healers, and all melee present in the group take Earthbreaker Haram and move him up the hill to the right of Gromash Hold, the keep, while the remaining tank, healers, and ranged DPS remain below. Separating the bosses simplifies the mechanics that the raid has to handle by cutting them in half. The group tanking Haram, the 2 tanks, healers, and melee, who are fighting at the top of the hill, only have to deal with the poison dot, the foul stream of poisonous water, and the wall of elementals, while the group below only deals with the tornadoes, slimes, and falling ash. This drastically simplifies the fight, making it much easier to heal. Tanks up top need to be very careful about ashen wall placement, and the melee and healers need to be very careful that they don't catch multiple people with the Toxic Stream ability. Regardless of what method is used, if the group is careful about placement of damaging effect, watches their feet, and reacts quickly to the mechanics, while the fight will often get rather chaotic and feel messy, the Shamans will go down. The final boss in the Gates of Retribution, Siege of Orgrimmar Raid Finder, is General Nazgrim, and it's a very ad-intensive fight. On top of continuously summoning adds, Nazgrim has his own resource, Rage, that must be handled properly by the raid. The first few weeks of this boss, when he was released, he counted for more wipes than even Garrosh himself, so be sure not to underestimate him. Nazgrim himself only has a few abilities, and will use an ability every 15 seconds. What ability he uses depends entirely on how much rage he has. His weakest ability, used with 30 rage, is Heroic Leap, which will leap on a random player and deal a decent amount of damage. However, more importantly, a few seconds after he's leaped, the ground will crack and an aftershock will go off, spreading out in 2 lines from where he landed. This must be avoided, not only due to the damage it causes, but also because it will generate additional rage for each person hit. His next ability is Korkron Banner, which causes all of his allies' attacks to also generate rage for him. This must be killed quickly. Next, he will use War Song if his rage reaches over 70, which will deal a large amount of damage to all players in the rage. Finally, if he reaches 100 rage, he will cast Ravager, which throws out a spinning axe that deals a large amount of damage to anyone it hits and generates more rage for Nazgrim. Thankfully, in Raid Finder difficulty, the axe does not persist for the duration of the fight and will despawn eventually. When tanking Nazgrim, tanks need to be mindful of his stacking debuff, Sunder Armor, which reduces the tank's armor not only because of the additional damage it causes, but due to the fact that Nazgrim generates additional rage for each stack of Sunder Armor on his current target. Tanks should swap at 3 stacks, or whenever their stacks fall off, though a 4th stack may occur on occasion. Nazgrim will cycle through 3 stances throughout the fight, which is largely ignorable in Raid Finder, with the exception of Defensive Stance. In Defensive Stance, no one should attack Nazgrim with the exception of his current tank, pets, or already applied dot effects. This is due to him generating rage every time he is struck by an attack in this stance, and attacking him at this time will very quickly ramp his damage to the raid, generally causing a wipe. Note, targets with Sunder Armor effect, aka the tanks, will not generate rage on Nazgrim, as well as pets, therefore it is safe to attack him with these methods. Due to the scarce timing in between ad waves, and the fact that tanks must never allow their Sunder Armor stacks to get too high, tanks can only occasionally help out with the ads. It is much more important for tanks to make sure tank swapping goes off cleanly, as the ads will deal much less damage to the raid untanked than Nazgrim will with additional rage. There are 4 types of adds to handle throughout the fight, and Nazgrim will summon 2 of the 4 types of adds periodically. The first and most important add is the Galakross Shaman. This add casts Greater Healing Wave that must be interrupted, and will drop healing totems on the ground, which should be killed quickly if the player with threat on the Shaman is not quick about moving the add away from it. These should never be brought near Nazgrim, and should be killed immediately upon their spawning. The second add that is important to kill in Raid Finder is the Galakross Assassin. These adds will fixate on a random player and attack them until they or the player are killed. They hit decently hard, but not so hard that it's not easily healable unless the player turns their back to them. If they catch the player's back, they will cast Backstab for very large amounts of damage, often killing the player. This is easily avoidable, but often is not in Raid Finder, which is why this add is number 2 on the priority list. The third add is the Galakross Arcweaver, a mage add that will target random players and cast Arcane Shock, a single target damaging spell, and Magistrike, which is an AoE at random players' locations that will also apply a dot on all players struck. It is important to interrupt this add's casts, as every Arcane Shock will increase the damage of the next spell by a decent amount, stacking continuously. Left out too long, they can start one-shotting players with Arcane Shock and devastate the raid with Magistrike. The final add is the Galakross Iron Blade. The Iron Blade simply blade storms around, dealing a fair amount of damage to all players struck by it, though they move slightly slower while blade storming and are avoidable, as well as their damage is heal-throughable. These are the only adds that are actually beneficial to tank, as they deal very little damage to tanks, and are held in place so they aren't spinning around the raid. Melee should only engage the adds while they are stunned, or otherwise not blade storming. Though it is helpful for tanks to hold these adds, bringing them to Nazgrim is not ideal, as it prevents melee from getting to the boss, and thus is often simpler to just let the DPS handle them, as they are not incredibly problematic. At 10%, Nazgrim will summon 2 waves of adds at once, so it is often a good idea to hold off DPS until you have just finished off an add wave before pushing him to this point, though on Raid Finder this is most likely not possible. Bloodlust should be blown at this point or just prior to this point, and the off-tank needs to immediately grab all the adds and pull them to the back of the room or as far from Nazgrim as possible. Shamans need to be burned down immediately upon spawning, but the other adds at this point should be ignored and DPS should be on Nazgrim once the Shamans are down. Burn the Shamans quickly, handle Nazgrim's rage-generating abilities properly, and make sure to handle all of the adds correctly, and General Nazgrim